Welcome everyone. I'm Jini Maxwell and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the second part of Writing for Orchestra, How to Record. In this panel, we'll be discussing how to get the most out of a recording session in a way that won't totally break the bank, how to work harmoniously and productively with other musicians, and how to communicate kind of the sound you want and make sure that's a feasible project for the musicians you're working with. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations and to pay my respect to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Today, we are joined once more by Nicolette Fraillon, Chief Conductor and Musical Director of the Australian Ballet and Artistic Director of Orchestra Victoria. So many hats, truly incredible. As well as musicians Erica Kennedy and Stuart Riley, as well as composer Austin Wintory, who's worked on several scores for games like Abzu, Assassin's Creed Syndicate, and one of my personal favourites, Jini. Hello, everyone. How are you doing?
Good.
Excellent.
Very well.
Feeling confident that the audience now will have just beautifully notated and formatted work that they'll bring to every recording session, I hope. So let's talk a little bit more about kind of the next step. Once you do have your work prepared, what does, in the kind of most basic terms, imagining you're working with someone, you're speaking to someone who doesn't have very much experience working with live musicians in general, what does a recording session look like? Does everyone just sort of sit down and play the piece fully through like a live performance? How's it structured?
I'm very quiet, so I'll start with that one. The first thing is the recording environments are just incredibly different. You know, there's no one recording space. I've done a recording session with, bit of name dropping here, Judith Durham from The Seekers, and I was in the studio where Judith and the engineer were in the control box, and it was just me and my headphones on in the recording space. And you go from that to, we've done recordings for a full orchestra in a symphony hall. So you can get anything in between. So they're all completely different, and they produce their own challenges.
Yeah, it's also worth saying that in terms of the way a session is organized, almost, if anything, it resembles more closely a rehearsal than a concert, because it's always very tactically arranged, where, for example, with my sessions, I'll try to, if I have a scale of difficulty of music for whatever reason, whether it's technical difficulty or it requires a lot of endurance or it has a really wide dynamic range and ask the musicians to really kind of go for a roller coaster. If we think of that forming a spectrum from 1 to 10 in difficulty, I'll try to start with one of the selections that might be like a 6 or a 7, so that it's enough for people to kind of get a sense of where things can go, but it's not going to hit them with the hardest thing out of the gate, but nor is it going to be this deceptively easy sleeper thing that starts us off kind of, disarmingly simply, and gives musicians a proper taste. Never mind that the engineers are also going to be looking for a taste of the total range of what's to come. And if you're heavily featuring timpani and it's a huge presence in the score, for example, and you start 5 charts in a row that have no timpani, an hour into your session, the engineer is going to be blindsided by a sound they hadn't heard yet, and it's going to cause a delay and all those kind of. So there's always these considerations that you make that have nothing to do with putting on a show. There's definitely never start at the beginning and move to the end. It's always trying to capture all these little, technical considerations. I'll just add.
And I'll add in another way, Jini, add to that, they are tactically usually and need to be really, really well planned in terms of approach, because sitting beside all the artistic considerations of what we might need to do to get the things down and budget money. So how can you work really quickly and most effectively, and whilst as a conductor in a normal rehearsal for a live performance, I'm kind of doing the same. This is far more pressured environment, and because you've got all the recording engineers and and all the technology as well. You need to plan them. They are planned really, really carefully, well in advance. And the closer you can do that and part of the conversation, the better result will be.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a pressured environment as a musician. I mean, this might sound a bit weird, but you know, you do a gig and it's gone, you know, and so you tend to take a few more risks. You go for it a bit more in a concert hall or a pit because it's gone. Microphone's a scary thing. It's there forever. So we tend to play in a. You obviously play the music to the best of your ability, but just a couple of percent within yourself, just so you get it right. Because also, if you get it wrong you make a mistake. We all make mistakes, but you force everybody else in that room to do that take again. And it might be your cor anglais soloist, just brilliant take, and you've just screwed it up by making your mistakes. So you just want to get it right. You play in a slightly conservative, defensive way. Accuracy is everything.
But I would actually also say you can argue the exact opposite, which is that you, for all intents and purposes, yes, of course, this is not true literally, but you can generally always do another take in the way that the concert hall, you blow that note, the show goes on, and it, for the audience, will forever be that note was cracked or out of tune or whatever. But you know, even especially in this world where Pro Tools makes everything so easy, sometimes you just say, oh, that take was brilliant, but the entrance was shaky right on the downbeat, so let's just grab bar one again and then crossfade it with the, you know, comp it into the rest of the take, move on. And so that, to me, there's a forgivingness to the studio environment that the live hall is merciless about.
Sure.
Just to devil's advocate your perspective slightly.
No, sure. And just to build on Austin's point from before as well, you know, the choice of the first track you do is really important to us because, you know, we've just got out the car, got the instrument out, and you've tuned up and you're in your local environment. We need to adjust to what we hear in that local space really quickly. So something like a 5 or 6 out of 10 is great for us because we, you know, I'm a bass player. I want to hear the cellos. Maybe I've got a single headphone on with a click track. What can I hear about me and them, and what's my local environment? And you pick that up very quickly in that first set, the first take you do.
Just, I guess, adding to that, but also going back to Stuart describing that different recording sessions as a session musician coming in as a player can be such different beasts depending on the size of the ensemble, the environment, you know, the music, everything. So as a violinist, I may be scheduled to do a week of recording with my orchestra, with Orchestra Victoria, and Nicolette's conducting, and usually in that situation, it's all been very, very well pre-prepared, and Nicolette's had time with the score. Ideally, we've been given practice parts, you know, a week or two beforehand, and we come in having a fairly good idea of what we're doing with time to prepare. And then there's the sliding scale of the differences from that. So we come down from that, and that would be a full orchestra all recording together in the same space in a big venue with a big budget, probably. Although you might be surprised, it's always worth asking. So then we come down from that, and maybe I'm doing a string section recording. And if it's a big string section recording, there might be 20 to 30 of us. Usually, if they're going to break it down into a separate string section, we don't usually get more than that. In that kind of situation with that number, I would still expect there would be a conductor. But as we start to break it down, we understand that it's potentially smaller budget, different situations. The conductor may not have had the music for as long. We usually in that situation haven't received practice parts beforehand. We come in and we sit down and we look at the notes, and we're very flexible and we're very quick, and we always want to do our best, but we come in understanding that that's the situation. And then again, it can go down from that. And most recently, the string section recordings that I've been doing have been groups of about 8, 12 maximum, you know, largely due to restrictions. But I think, you know, more and more recordings will go this way, and they can be very effective depending on what you're writing and its context. And in that situation, I would come in, and just by being booked as the first violin in the first chair, then I actually take on a different role in that kind of session. And I'm, in some effect, it's a collegial sort of experience, but I'm kind of taking the helm a little bit and leading, and I come in and I see the parts usually for the first time in that situation. So in that kind of regard, you have to, I guess, understand when your session musicians are walking in, the situation that they're expecting and the situation that they're walking into. So if you're booking a session for 8 string players and you have some horrendous high running lick passages that are really quite tricky, we'll do our best and we'll do a good job, but it might take a little bit of time. Like, we probably won't be able to nail it in 30 seconds of just trying to work it out. So in that situation, if you know there's something particularly tricky, do try and get some parts to the players a day or two at least beforehand, because it will speed up the process. So I think this is what you're saying, Austin, like, don't go straight in at 10. In that kind of situation where you know the players haven't had preparation and they're just sitting down and seeing it for the first time and you've only got 3 hours, then you're not going to get the best result.
So preparation is kind of a theme, like being properly prepared is kind of a theme that has come up across both of these panels. But I wonder, imagine, you know, a composer is generally doing the right things. You know, all of their materials are clear. They've been trying to communicate clearly. How can they best, I guess, kind of conduct themselves in that session to kind of maybe remove that sort of defensive edge from the musician's experience? What can they be doing either on the page or between people to kind of make things easier?
Well, I'd just like to add something to that. Studios are weird places, they're weird environments. And, you know, we're all looking at each other in different rooms right now, but we can see each other. And, you know, eyeball communication is really sort of important. We often don't get that in a studio space. We've got a control box somewhere. It might be next door to the room that we're in, which is fantastic. But we rely as musicians in that recording space on people from the control box who hear very different things to us acoustically in the recording space to give us some feedback. And that feedback is an absolute art form. I'm sure there have been PhDs written on how recording engineers speak to musicians in a way that is to the point. We really need to know what's wrong because we maybe don't know, we can't hear that where we are. So tell us, Stuart, just work on the tuning with the cellos on that F sharp, and we'll do it. We want to do that. We really want to get it right as musicians. So it needs to be succinct and to the point, but also it needs to be in a way that doesn't sort of puncture delicate musical egos, shatter careers in the process, and there is a fine line between the two.
I have many times as a conductor in sessions, you know, you can see the very specific musician that is having trouble. And there's any number of reasons why that could be, and it's usually not, if it's somebody that got the call to be in the chair that day, it's not for lack of talent or hard work. You know, we're all human beings. They could have had they could be under the weather, they could have gotten bad news in their personal life that morning. It doesn't matter what could be kind of rattling their focus. And obviously the top professionals, you know, will do a good job at kind of somehow compartmentalizing their mental distractions and just focusing on the task at hand, but there's only so far that can take you. And so I've many times, you can see it's that person and your heart always goes out to them. And so the number of times that I've just said, let's take an A as my broad way to cover for them and say, like, I know that I'm not going to sit here and call you out in front of the group, but maybe something that gives us a breath. We probably wouldn't benefit from taking another A anyway. It probably wouldn't hurt, rather. We would all benefit from it. And it could give them a chance to catch their breath because, yeah, it becomes a feedback loop where if you say, you know, Stuart, it's just not working. I mean, and there's only so many of those where now I'm actually making it worse. And it's not productive anymore. It's actually quite counterproductive. And it can be difficult, especially a real exposed solo or something in front of all of your colleagues sitting there quietly judging you, or not quietly.
I think isn't it also, and there's no one way of sort of hierarchy in the recording studio, but trying to sort out who's actually going to give the feedback on and in what way, because the producer or the person in charge of the recording who's sitting there with score and everything has responsibilities, and they're relating that to the audio engineers, and they've got one set of responsibilities, and as a conductor I'm relying on them because they are in a way the ears of what's coming through. In some cases that is a composer, most often it's not. It's easiest, in one way if the composer is conducting, as Austin does, but often the composer is sitting in the studio, and then it might be that between what I'm doing and what the recording engineer is saying, Austin's sitting there going, that's nothing like what I want though. So sorting out the hierarchy of who says what and in which way is really important. And often as the bunnies in the middle, is the conductor or the players, you can sit there waiting for someone to make a call, and you're sort of losing time. We had an example of this last year where it was like, okay, someone tell us something, like we know, and there's endless silence, and we're down in this studio going, okay, someone say something to us. And so the making sure that your recording engineer or producer has spent time with composer, if they can, ideally, and with conductor to work out that sort of hierarchy. And also as a composer, understanding the process and being able to let go at times to those who are the experts and say, okay, that is going to get result, but also knowing when to intervene and say, that's actually not what I'm after. So, and there is no one way, but actually, again, Jini, it comes back to even the first session, communication and prep in advance in that sort of planning who's going to do what and what role you're in the studio really helps.
And I think developing your own style is really important. Humour's quite good in this environment. So in one session I did many years ago, there was one section that wasn't quite on the beat, was a little bit late, and somebody from the box said, "You know that bit there? It hasn't been early yet."
Yeah, I'm a fan of that kind of conduct. Like I very often. And actually, this isn't so much that as it is a genuine perception of mine, is I tend to not regard if, from an intonation standpoint, things are coming in a little higher or lower. I usually express that as, can we brighten or darken the pitch? Because that's actually generally my perception of it. I don't have perfect pitch, so I don't even think if you had perfect pitch, this would even make sense anyway. But the idea that there's sort of one truly perfect frequency, down to the nanohertz that represents that pitch, that, on some level we are, if not collectively, certainly personally, subjectively saying that's an A, that's an A sharp, that's a B. And but every now and again, we're not all quite in agreement, so I'll just suggest we brighten the tone a little. And sometimes it's done with a wink and a nod in the way that you're describing, and sometimes it is actually more kind of earnestly about the product and not, avoiding fragile egos, compromising them. And there's a strategy actually that I can also recommend, just as one final little anecdote on that front, though. I've tag teamed. I'll often have a booth reader or some type of, or maybe my orchestrator or somebody in the booth, who will be kind of my additional set of ears and my double check to make sure, as Nicolette, you said, they are hearing it through the speakers, which is actually more accurate to the final goal than what the podium is telling you, since the microphones hear a different thing than the acoustic movement through the space.
Yeah.
And so between the engineer and whoever is in that kind of role, booth reader, producer, whomever in the booth, I will make sure that I trust them implicitly. And there's every now and again a thing where, though I am in charge, they'll help each other out, where if there's a problem, rather than calling out, Stuart, damn it, I'll say, I think that one was, I think we were pretty good. We're pretty close there. And the engineer will say something like, for me, just as a flight of fancy, let's do another one, and they'll get a sense of like, this is because of some technical thing that none of you need to worry about. I'm just adjusting some knobs here. In reality, it might be because the take was not quite in tune or whatnot, but there's a certain sense of relaxing, like, okay, we're good. Well, let's just play. And sometimes that psychological release that comes from thinking, oh, we have it, the performance will actually then go, like, it happens all the time where I'll say, this is a safety take. We got it. Don't worry about it. But in reality, it's it's the final take because we don't quite have it, and there's something about the relaxation that then comes that almost always nails it at that point.
Yeah.
And that's having really experienced team too, Austin, because I come back to the planning side of things. Two extreme versions of how we might be contracted as an orchestra or a conductor go into sessions. One is I get a score and people will say, I'll be asked, how many sessions do I think I'll need to get this down, right? And depending on what the score is or how we're recording or whatever, I can give an answer. That's kind of ideal world. But even then, I'm calculating and talking to the composer about what do you think, how many extra takes might we need? Are there particularly difficult soli? Is it really heavy on the brass? So I think through all of that in coming up with an answer, which leaves time for takes and retakes, and for some days where everything miraculously works first time, and for those dreadful sessions which you always have sometime in the week where nothing is working. So I calculate that. The complete opposite end of the spectrum is a presenter who comes in and says, you've got 3 sessions. That's it, Nicolette. What are you going to do? And that is then even more pressured, and we don't have time necessarily to do another take, or we need a really experienced team in the box and on the podium and composer together going, was it good enough? I'm going to have to make a call now. This next section is really more important, or most important is this is ensemble. I can fix this up in post-production with balance, so I'm not going to do this again. The team that really works out what we can do together in post-production versus actually in the recording studio, and there are things in between, but it is all planning either way.
And another thing that adds to that is actual physical location of the control box versus the recording space. Yes. Because quite often we'll do a take, and it's great to obviously hear things through a monitor, fix this, but if we've got time to put the bass down, go in the box and actually hear it, and then have a discussion in there, it's so much clearer. That second take is going to be much closer if we can do that. But depends on your layout in your space. We did a recording last year where the recording box was 5 miles away from where we were. So when you actually go and have a listen, you've got to go up 17 stairs to get there, and it eats into your recording time quite a lot. So you've got that balance between communication, rapid communication, getting to the point quickly, versus how much time you take to do that.
I wonder, prompted by an excellent audience question, how those dynamics change when recording remotely, which I imagine is something people have more experience with now over the last 18 months. So Ben Hooton asks, have you had experience working with a remote session orchestra? I've heard of options available in Eastern Europe, etc.
I could just start, if I start off with one thing, let's just take intonation, which is one, and tuning, which is one part of what we do. We've done lots of remote recordings for chamber groups and orchestras and things with a click track. That's great from a rhythm point of view because we follow the same click, but I can't hear the cello, I can't hear the bassoon. We might be playing the same lines, but I can't hear their track, I can't hear their detailed tuning. Now, obviously my intonation's perfect, obviously, but seriously now, that there are very subtle variations of leading notes and certain notes where the tuning, we're not perfectly tempered like a piano. We're going to change the tuning slightly. When I'm recording in my bedroom on my own, I can't hear the other instruments, and that's really tricky.
Not to mention that style remote recording of kind of the army of soloists that are all cobbled together it exaggerates those intonation differences. You can have 40 string players that all played the correct notes, but because there is these microtonal differences, you end up with this thing that sounds quite grotesque, that in a room, even if everybody played seemingly precisely the same way, there's also something about the way it all coalesces in a room, never mind the adjustment that you then make to all agree on where you are. But even if you weren't doing that, a section of 12 violins is somehow acoustically a very different phenomenon than 12 violins individually. It's one of those, strings are substantially unique in this way. It's always fascinated me as a composer that there's this aggregating effect. It's like, I always think of it by way of analogy that a single H2O molecule does not have the properties of being wet. So at what point have we added up enough of them that now we can righteously call something wet? There's no defining line there. It's an emergent property that is sort of, you know it when you see it, and I find string sections have that as well, and it makes the remote recording, the particular breed of remote recording of the Army of Soloists, you know, especially daunting. But separately, the notion of remote recording where you're just in a different location. I've recorded in Eastern Europe many times where I'm, you know, it's midnight for me and it's 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. for them, and we have Pro Tools open, so I can get a really high quality, although usually very late, audio feed, and then like a Skype call that operates as our talkback, where I can communicate with the conductor and with the booth, and we've, you know, I've done huge amounts of scores that way when we, you know, I just needed a little bit of strings or something, or even if I needed a lot of strings, but our budget was, you know, tight that we could afford, like we could afford a nice lush sound. We really needed it, but also, you know, some of the orchestras there work at rates that are just wildly different than if you're in London or Australia or in the US or other, you know, other places where, you know, you're getting, it's just the per player per hour rates are going to be quite different. And that often entails a lot of trust that you've prepared everything and you're handing it to somebody that can be somewhat self-sufficient. Because, for example, what do you do if the internet goes down for 5 minutes? I don't want them to stop and wait for me, you know, because the whole point of why I'm in this situation, I didn't fly there or whatever, is because time and money tend to be short. So the last thing I want is for something as fragile as an internet connection to be the reason why we don't deliver. So I'll just try to make sure that the parts are very clear. I also tend to write personally simpler parts so that there's fewer questions that might arise, and that it can be self-explanatory. The page can contain all the clues as opposed to, you know, constantly needing to talk to me. And with a little bit of that conservatism, you know, if it turns out I'm off the call for 10 minutes, I come back and I know I've got good material waiting for me. It's not ideal because sometimes you like to make subjective adjustments. Oh, you know, that octave leap in bar 7, can we put a big portamento into the beat on that, you know, sliding right into beat 3 across that line? That may occur to me in the moment, and not, you know, hearing them play it, I realize, oh, that was missing. I didn't think to put that in the part. And obviously you don't get the benefit of being able to do that if your connection goes down, but at least you'll get something. So, you know, that sort of thing for me is the big difference between when I know I'm remote and not. A certain amount of sovereignty of the musicians is, I think, baked into the equation. You just have to know that you trust them and you've equipped them to be sovereign.
And that kind of remote group recording has happened quite a bit within Australia over the last year. I mean, I guess Stuart and I, we've been among the cohort who've been sort of most locked down as players in Melbourne. So the majority of that sort of remote recording that we've done has been us at home on our own, multi-tracking and layering and all that kind of thing, which is, you know, you've gone into the problems that come along with that. But we've had Melbourne producers and composers who have been remotely taking recording sessions in Sydney. And they've had groups, you know, of 20 players in a studio in Sydney, and they've been doing it that way as well. But I mean, Stuart, we've both done quite a lot of recording ourselves, you know, in isolation. And I've done a few with a small number of other players where the tracks have come in, and I've attempted to sort of layer and multi-track, and that has been very, very tricky. I guess because you are not in the space with that player. Yes, I can go over and I can hear what they've recorded. I can do my best to match it. I can see the sound waves, but I can't feel and see that player breathing and moving. And it's very difficult. And I mean, from my experience, the most success that I've had is like very small projects where I've basically just layered parts with myself. Because I've felt how I've played it each time. Always, if I think ideally you have more than one player, you get that, like you were saying, Austin, that mix of sound that creates a whole nother sound itself. But, you know, as means, then we do our best, don't we?
Yeah, that's right. And I think as a musician sat in the studio doing a Gregorian, I suppose I'm listening to three different things. I'm listening to the click that's coming in through my earpiece. I'm listening to me. I'm listening to my own tune and my own sound. But I'm also listening to everything that's going on around me. In a bigger string section, there might be four basses. And those who are not familiar with maybe orchestral musicians may not know that we are constantly adjusting to the sound we get around us. And in a section of, say, 16 first violinists, they'll be making micro adjustments to the use of the bow so they actually blend in with each other. And it's one of the marvelous things about working with an orchestra is watch how quick that happens. Now, the first two factors, the click, your own tuning, you can do that remotely in your bedroom. You can't do that sound tuning adjustments, which is really, really fundamental to a good recording. You can't do that on your own.
And I'll just add, coming back to actually touching on something that Erica and Austin both said, in the group recording, so where you as a composer are remote, we have had to do more of that, much more because of COVID, even within Australia, not sort of financial means. And even with the small groups that we could get in with Melbourne and compose remotely, it works really well. But you really do need someone on the ground as a composer that you really, really trust, and you know as the ears in the booth, as well as the musicians that you trust. If you drop out, or even without that, because that person on the ground is going to be dealing with a whole lot of things for you, that you go, okay, but it'll still be okay. I know that I'll get the material that I need. And finding the right person that you work with well in advance is kind of and can play that role for you is really key. As someone who's had to play that role, I don't want to get in the way of the composer and the musicians talking directly with a small ensemble if there's no conductor, but I'm in the booth. And sometimes for time you're going, actually, I'm just going to have to do some translation here, or you're going to have to trust me at this point, Austin, because we're going to actually have to do this now to get it done. So finding the person that you could, or having dialogue in advance so that you know if you don't know anyone, but you've really done your prep work and that you can trust them in some way so that you can still get the result that you need with the time that you have is really useful and important.
And that can translate to in-person, face-to-face real-life sessions as well. Yeah. Like we're talking about the relationship between the composer in the booth and the person, and if it's a different person out the front, on the podium, then that trust between the two doesn't just apply to just remote recording.
Absolutely. There's another great question here. Someone from the audience asks, for those just starting out, what options are there for those with less experience to observe and learn from others' recording sessions? And is that something you'd even recommend?
Nah.
Nah. Just wing it.
Yeah, we'd hate to frighten you off.
I was actually Austin, you could probably talk to this a bit more, but I was listening to the earlier session and I was thinking, well, it would be an amazing starting point for somebody to actually come into the booth and observe a working session, whether it be small group or large orchestra. But that would be invaluable, and you'd see firsthand all of these working processes that we're talking about, the relationships.
Yeah, I've been very lucky, living in Los Angeles. There's quite a bit of recording that happens here for film and TV, and I've been able to be in the room or in the booth for James Horner, John Williams, Alan Silvestri. The very first session I ever went to, I was 16. I got to go to an episode of The Simpsons at the Warner scoring stage, where they do every single episode. There's 700 plus episodes now of that show, 30 years running. And every single one is sort of a modest sized orchestra that's sort of amped up in the rhythm and brass section to be almost like a Mancini-esque, jazz orchestra, kind of a big band with strings. And getting to see those different workflows, the different styles of different composers, and also just the sense of what different budgets buy you. I went to a few sessions of James Horner's on Avatar, and they were moving through like a queue a day. It was the slowest speed I've ever seen in my entire life, because they had something like 30 days worth of double sessions booked to get through that music, and well over 100-piece orchestra every time, and then overdubs with 80 voice choirs, and they were spending millions and millions and millions of dollars just on the score, and you could feel that there was just absolutely no time pressure whatsoever. I mean, that project was the ultimate of luxury I've probably ever witnessed in my life. Probably one of the most that could ever exist, period. So it's fascinating to see how they sort of grew to the size of their container. And then I've also been to sessions where, you know, they were hustling like mad because, you know, this 3 hours is all that we get for this project. And so, yeah, being a fly on the wall for those kinds of things. And also for me, the big lessons were always the different types of tones in the room. Never mind all the pragmatic things that you learn, but just the way that people conduct themselves. And I don't mean it in the literal conductor sense, but the way in which they relate to the musicians, the way that you know, some people seem like they're just having the time of their life and they're making it a really fun day for everybody. And then others are there with this almost militaristic, we're here to do a job. And, you know, when the clock strikes 1 p.m., we're done, and not 1 second later. And so everybody better focus and pay attention. And there's technically no right or wrong, although I always felt very at home when it felt like, can you believe we're paid for this? This is just the best, you know, it's just a party. And so, yeah, being a fly on the wall was invaluable. And I always, you know, I routinely will invite folks to my sessions, especially if I know, you know, I'm fairly often emailed by younger composers who are just starting, and you know, if I know I'm going to be proximate to where one of them lives, and I'll be recording, I've routinely had people come and just hang out, and then I'll say, you know, after it's over and the clock's not ticking, I'm happy to go through if there's something that you saw, witnessed, where you thought, what was that about, or why was the engineer asking about such and such, or you just keep a note of that stuff, and hopefully, you know, we can answer your questions. And because God knows that having that opportunity for me was, you know, more powerful than any university education I could name. And I was grateful to have a decent one of those too, but there's just nothing like seeing people in action.
So in Australia, Jini, I would recommend then, you know, keep track of the composers who are writing for film and what's being recorded and how you can find that out yourself. People like Jess will help you as well. Jessica Wells, who was on the previous call, you know, what's actually happening, who's working, ask them, get in touch, you know, what's the worst can happen? Someone says no, get in touch with the orchestras if you know recording, you know, if we can. COVID's restricting things at the moment because we've got limitations on how many people are allowed to be in the booth. So there are other things that currently make it a little bit challenging, but we'll be past that soon. And just ask the questions, and you will get yeses. You will, and then talk to the next person, or that will lead to, what would you like to come back? We've talked about as an orchestra, you know, when we can invite people into rehearsals so that you're actually listening. If there are rehearsals ahead of the recording sessions, sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. Sometimes we as an orchestra will just choose to do those because the material is difficult. We don't look like shit in a recording studio, so we're going to have some rehearsals in advance. And we choose to do that. So come along and listen and see what's happening in the rehearsal and then in the booth. So find out via APRA AMCOS as well. Find out what's going on. Use your organisations, use your people, and ask, and you will uncover and create learning opportunities. And it is the best possible thing. It's the best. Nothing, just like, you know, nothing compared you as a player for your first rehearsal. It's learning how to rehearse and play, or as a conductor, you need to have observed sessions and see what's going on. And ideally, you know, if someone will invite you in even to the pre-meetings, to the discussions, to listen, what are people talking about? Simple things that, you know, you will learn that you need to ask. A call isn't a call. So, you know, every orchestra has different agreements as to how long they're allowed to play. Different again if you're hiring session musicians and how long a call is, you know, because everyone's made the mistake of going, oh, I thought I had 4 hours and I've got 2.5 now. So learning the kinds of questions to ask to be able to evaluate how much time you think you're going to need for your piece, that kind of thing.
It seems like kind of on top of preparation, really like relationship building is the other thing that's so important about working kind of in this sort of space. And I remember actually when we were speaking about working on a small budget in our pre-interview, Austin, you had kind of an anecdote about your early career and how you would engage musicians that I wondered if you wanted to share.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, the communication to me is an outgrowth of just the idea that it's easy, especially for a young composer growing up in the 21st century. Probably they're not writing by hand. Probably they're using virtual instruments, VSTs as we call them, or sample libraries, to create mock-ups, or in many cases that's the final product, and they're maybe adding one musician on top or something like that, if per the example I'm about to tell you. But the result of which, I think, of growing up where music is not this abstracted thing when you're writing by hand and it's sort of a printed part or a conductor score that you've written out, to me is like potential energy. It's not really music, it's just paper. And it's a deceptive thing to play with your MIDI keyboard into a computer, and you get the immediate feedback, and it feels like, oh, I've actually made a piece of music. I don't ever feel like I've made a piece of music if I'm writing by hand, which is part of the reason why I like writing by hand. It doesn't become real until a musician makes it real. And so it's never like, there's a cellist that I love working with, named Tina, who I never actually label the part cello. I always label it Tina. It's like Tina with a bass clef, because it's not written for cello. It's written for her, and especially because she and I have known each other for so long, I can lean into her eccentricities that I know she's particularly great at, and she can play. I routinely write for her in violin range, because she's just one of these freakish cellos that just can play into the stratosphere without breaking a sweat. And so, like, those are things that I leverage as a part of that. And the anecdote, Jini, that you're referring to, was that early on, especially before I had any of those relationships, I would just invite musicians over to my studio, and which, especially early on, studio was code for like the living room or whatever, and say, can I buy you lunch? But before we go, can I just put some music in front of you? And I remember I at one point I created this little art project of a little piece of music for every day of the year with a friend of mine who was an amateur photographer. So the idea was, I'll write like a short little 1-minute piece. And I realized, oh, this is a great way to get to know every musician. I need 365 pieces of music. I didn't think about the scope of this project before I agreed to do it. Because, even at 1 minute a piece, we're talking about hours and hours and hours of music. But I would say, okay, I want to feature, piccolo. So I would call, and my studio was near one of the recording studios in Los Angeles. So I would call a musician and say, are you going to be at Warner Brothers recording anytime in the next couple of weeks? Oh, I'll be there on Thursday for a movie or whatever. Would you mind coming an hour early, or can I borrow you when you're done for the day for just a few minutes, and I'll buy a coffee or something like that? And to the point that Nicolette made a moment ago, 99% of the time the answer was yes. And not just yes, but they would say, I would say, can I pay you for your time? And they say, honestly, just, you're not asking for much, and it'd be my pleasure. And we'd save the trouble of, invoices and contracts, and it's more, all that's more headache than it's worth. We don't have to navigate any union considerations. It's very easy. I'm leaning into what's convenient for them. I get to know a musician, and I get to experience, instrument by instrument by instrument. I mean, I did dozens and dozens and dozens of these. One of the most memorable ones was a soprano had actually cold called me. She was looking for work. She had found my name somewhere. So she calls me and says, I sing with the LA Master Chorale and and I'm trying to do more solo work, and if you ever need a soprano. And I was in the middle of this little musician a day art project thing. So I said, oh, why don't you come over? And I thought it'd be fun to do a sort of folk-like arrangement of the opening movement of the Brahms Requiem. So I was like taking the orchestral part and redoing it as a steel guitar, kind of twangy, sitting by the riverside, but then featuring the original soprano part as Brahms wrote it. And so she showed up to my studio expecting to have coffee. And I said, there's a mic was sitting here already set up by the couch. And I said, I don't suppose I could talk you into singing a bit of the Brahms Requiem, could you? And she just stood up and without missing a beat, just stood at the microphone and says, on a vowel or in German? And just from memory, cold. And it was like, well, I can tell you who I'm going to be writing a lot of soprano for in the future. It's because in her mind, she's also developing a client relationship. I'm a source of work for her now, and so that's another reason why the musicians are usually all too happy to do it, because it's a mutually beneficial relationship. We're all better off for it. And I was so impressed. It blew my mind that she was just so ready to go, and for what was supposed to be a little coffee hang. And so I'm always recommending, musicians, we all got to eat, we all got to have a drink or a coffee or something like that. And if you can find a way to lump all that together, especially if it's super modest in scale, you'll find overwhelmingly people will say yes.
Stuart and Erica, I wonder if you could speak to that from kind of a musician perspective.
Well, yeah, look, I absolutely agree. I mean, I'm not going to have grandkids, but one day to be able to say, "Hey, I played some music with Austin Wintory."
The blight on your
forget John Williams.
Otherwise, great record.
Yeah, Look, I mean, we're very happy to be involved in that project and proud to do so. We really would be.
Yeah, I think for 99.9% of us, I mean, what we do, it's all about really close personal communication and connection, and we love just working in that close way, and we love being a part of development as well. It's a treat for us as much as the person that we're helping, because we're all sort of making the music together and finding the sound, and we always learn something in the process as well. So it would not be often that somebody would say no to that, I think. And also you lead on then to the actual sort of more official type, booked recording session, and we get much more out of it too if we've been able to help composers get to a certain point, when the red light goes on. It makes our lives easier too, and you're better off sort of doing that work. It's much more enjoyable for all involved if you can do it over a coffee with a nice, close, personal, no time pressure kind of working relationship than when everybody's suddenly under the pump.
And also, for those of us that don't really improvise that much, I'm very much a classical bass player, not a jazz head. But if we don't have music to play, then we're not musicians, and we have as musicians huge respect for composers, huge respect, and a loyalty to doing what the composers want. So I think it's a really important part of our whole game.
Given we don't have too much time left, I might try to focus a bit more on audience questions, because the audience has been very enthusiastic and forthcoming, which is excellent.
Oh, good.
We have a few kind of more technical ones that I thought might be interesting to get into. Mina Shamali asks, what's a common pitfall when combining solo recordings from the studio with ensemble recordings from a stage?
I know Mina. Very lovely fellow.
Doing a very, very cool score for Enchanted currently.
Oh, that's good. I like to hear that. I can just, it's essentially rehashing a lot of what we've already mentioned about things like the musicians reacting to something that's already been laid down. If for example, if I'm overdubbing a soloist over an orchestral track or a chamber group that has already recorded, that's better than playing to nothing, and it's better than playing to a mock-up. But it also means that whatever subjective decisions were made in the room that day, that soloist is now beholden to. So that includes intonation and phrasing and all kinds of other things, all those little micro things that would be going on subconsciously and consciously in the moment are now kind of the fixed point in the sky that you have to navigate from. And that can be okay. That can actually be quite helpful. It can kind of take things off the table for the musician to have to worry about, because it is what it is. And it can maybe make it more efficient. But it also means that if your plan is to write this super expressive solo or something that you want them to have a lot of latitude with, and you box them into a corner ahead of time and prevent that from happening, that's, be aware that you're setting that scenario up and there's kind of no way out of it. But also, all the pitfalls mentioned before of, you know, where if the musicians are just not able to hear each other, it's going to be a little bit of a toss up to see what happens.
Just on that, following on from Austin, what Austin said about boxing the soloist in. So what we can try and do is have the soloist there at that recording session, or so at least you've got they're having a say in how things are going to happen. So you can, if you can do that, then that can help remedy some of those limitations. It's not all of it, but it is such a good tip to be aware of, that what you lay down, all those decisions, then that's it. So try and get the soloist in. Have had the discussions, if it's something which involves conductor, with them, so that they're aware of what the soloist would like and has had sessions in advance of that before you actually lay it down. So there are things that you can do to help with that.
This is a more technical one that I thought was interesting. Mark asks, whose choice is mic placement, given it can drastically change the mood of a piece, and how important is it?
Good question. Mic placement and which mics for different instruments. I can tell you for a fact, it's not the musicians. As a bass player, I just do what I'm told, and the wonderful people from the box will come over and just move that mic up a little bit or move it a bit, and I don't go anywhere near it. We're told what mics we use. I sit there and play.
I have had musicians, though, especially like horn and instruments that are very acoustically sensitive, like just as a low-hanging fruit example, you would never ever place a mic right in front of the bell of a French horn, because that's not the sound that anybody wants on this planet. And so but where you place it, how much reflection, that's an interesting question. And I've had musicians before where they went, they heard a recording of something that they did and particularly liked it, went and asked the engineer, what did you do? And then when I'm working with them a year later, they'll say, you do what you want, but just as a suggestion, I was with so-and-so and they actually put a U87 here and it was really great sounding at the end. And there've been times where he said, it turned to the engineer, who's the main decision maker here, of course, in this department, and say, you mind if we do that, or can we set up a backup there to record that, to see what we end up with, or whatever? And I've gotten pretty amazing results, because the musicians, again, that's one of those things that the musician that resonates with and identifies with the idea of being a recording musician, they start to care and pay attention to details like that. Or like Stuart, when you mentioned going into the booth and saying, it's all well and good for how we felt in the room, but what's coming out of the speakers? That's all that is going to matter from this day forward. And the ones that really lean into that and embrace that, I've even had sessions before with these LA studios musicians where they think of themselves as part of the filmmaking team, and they'll raise a hand and say, curiosity, is this a dialogue scene or is this like an action scene or what? Because it actually frames the decision making, and it can even boil down into articulation and bowing and all sorts of things when they realize, how do we fit in the larger whole, as opposed to if you're just recording classical repertoire, it's easy to think I am the be all end all part of it, because in that case you are as a musician. We are listening to your recording of the Mendelssohn Midsummer Night's Dream. Like that is the piece. But if it's a score, you are but one part of it. We are all but one part of it. And the different questions and the different ways to address them that come up to me always is a good indicator of how much the musician has done this before and likes it, embraces the idea that we're putting together, we're all aggregating, and we're like those medieval cathedral builders where no one of us can ever be responsible for what comes out of the final product. It's bigger than any of us.
And also it slightly affects the way you play, because you do get a little bit of mechanics. If the mic's too close to a bass, you're going to get a little bit of bow noise or pizzicato noise. You move the mic further away, you're going to get more bloom. Now, most engineers want to control that with a drier sound and then manage that afterwards. And for most of the recordings we do, because the bass is obviously the best sound you can ever have, obviously. I often record with two. I have a clip-on close mic, and I have an ambient microphone a little bit further away on 2 tracks, and that gives the recording guys a lot of control to depending on what I'm actually playing.
and slightly different aspect for that, and I'm sure Erica can think of examples that we've worked on together. It depends on the competencies of the recording engineer as well. So it's the engineer, and I have a huge respect for recording engineers, and they, like instrumentalists who will choose a particular kind of instrument that they want to play on, and that's what they know best. Engineers have preferences for microphones and equipment that they want to use, so I have huge respect for that. But I've also been in situations with same orchestra, same instruments, same piece of music even, recording, and an engineer will say the direct opposite to what the one said to me a week ago about the best way to capture the cello sound as well. And so it can be quite a sensitive thing to navigate, because I don't want to just automatically go, well, that's such rubbish, because I'm sorry, how come your colleague said this? But I do have to navigate it as well. Or like the recording last year that Erica was doing was a chamber music one, where it was pretty clear that we weren't getting the sound that we needed, and that there was something going on that the recording engineer perhaps wasn't aware of. So you have to tactfully negotiate that, trust them. It's like speaking to the musicians in the studio. It's no difference with your colleagues, but learning also how to do it in such a way that you're still standing up for what you want, where you can go, hey, I get it, but could we just try this instead, because I really still not quite what I'm envisaging as a sound. Or so learning how to do that, and the more you learn about recording studio and equipment itself, also the better that is. But it can be quite a delicate thing to navigate.
And like you're saying, Nicolette, it can change depending on your room, everybody else that you're working with. I've done sessions where it's been like solo or duo, and I've brought my own mics in, not knowing what to expect. And sometimes that's worked really well, and other times it hasn't, because it didn't work with the people I was working with, and it didn't work with the room and the space. And so it's kind of, and then other times, like Stu, we rock up and we're part of like 80 musicians, and you stay out of it. You don't want to be making everybody's life more difficult.
Finally, I thought, there's a spicy or non-spicy version of the final question I want to ask. Maybe I'll just offer both, because they are back to back. Mark asks, as sample libraries are getting so realistic, is it acceptable to use a completely digital score? And Simon of Grand Prize Big Fuzz asks, what can we do to get more composers recording with live musicians rather than using samples? So maybe we can, I can spend 2.5 minutes fighting it out.
I'll happily give the last word to these wonderful musicians, and I'll just simply say that sample libraries can be quite amazing, and there's a lot of, and they're a fabulous tool. But they are frozen in time with whatever was done at the time of the sampling, and musicians are living, breathing entities. And I every session walk away with something that, given infinite time, I could not have made a sample library do, because it's nuanced and subtle, and it's based around the personalities of the people in the room, the sound of the room, all of that. So to me, I don't see how you could possibly ever replace that. And I will be quiet now.
It's a huge subject. I mean, we don't just play a series of notes that come together as a series of files stitched together. They're actually joined together, and I'm not sure you can get that with a sample library.
Absolutely. Nicolette and Erica, did you have anything to add there?
I sort of wanted to say, well, I mean, if that's what you've got and that's what you can do, then, do your best, but it's just, there's no comparison. It's just not a living, breathing thing. You can't hear the soul of it. You can't hear the nuances, the subtlety. It can't make your spine tingle in the same way. It's just not that I've ever heard.
Yeah, then the things that, and sounds have become more and more sophisticated and better, but you can't replicate that breath that Erica referred to, that sort of communal, here we are breathing together, slowing down, speeding up. That always sounds artificial. You can pick recordings straight away that are only synthetic because of that. But it's also not necessarily the most time efficient, because to go through a whole series of samples to find the note A on the violin that in the particular sound that you want, when you can got musicians there, and Eric can do it for you in a fraction of a second that it will take you through to sort it and replicate it. it can be way more time efficient and as well as better results to have live orchestra. But we all understand that one doesn't always have that, and you can now get some great results through
And
sound.
you can blend them. I
Yeah.
did one recently where I had a very steady Collegno thing with strings that would have actually been way more trouble than it was worth to record. So I wrote a bunch of stuff around it for the orchestra, kept the Collegno as samples because it was better for everybody.
Yeah.
You know, so like it's a tool like any other tool.
And I guess that goes back to you. Well, then how do you start with live musicians? Like Austin was saying, you start one at a time if that's what you need to do.
Yeah. And I think I'm thinking of that process as something quite reciprocal and collegial and creative, rather than, you know, I must perfect my craft and then hand it down to someone else. Doesn't need to begin at that level.
No, you'll never feel ready. Every composer, no matter how old they are, experienced, will walk into a big recording session, especially with a lot of crap that I prepare sufficiently, or my T's crossed and my I's dotted. You'll never be given the magic seal of, you know, okay, have at it. You know, you didn't just accept that. Don't talk yourself out of it.
Absolutely. I think that's the perfect kind of call to action to end on, actually. Thank you so much, everyone. I think this panel's been great. It's been such a delight talking to you. And I hope that all the audience enjoys the rest of High Score. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
you.